The little girl's voice cut through Seattle's winter morning like a knife through silk, stopping a man who'd made his fortune ensuring people never stopped him for anything. Killian Gallo had just stepped from his renovated brownstone onto Capitol Hill's frost-covered sidewalk when 3-year-old Tilly broke from her mother's grip and ran directly into his path. Her small boots slapped against ice-crusted concrete, pink knit cap sitting crooked on her head, one mitten dangling from the string threaded through her coat sleeves. Behind her, Vienna gasped and lunged forward, but the child had already planted herself in front of a man whose tailored charcoal coat probably cost more than their monthly rent. Tilly looked up with eyes that held no understanding of social hierarchies or the dangerous reputation that made grown men cross streets to avoid this particular neighbor. She asked her question with the directness only children possess, words tumbling out before her mother could snatch her back to safety. "Can you fix our door?" "Mommy's scared." The statement landed between them with surprising weight, 5 words that contained entire stories about broken locks and sleepless nights. Tilly pointed across the street toward the 3-story walk-up, where paint peeled from window frames and the front entrance hung slightly askew. Her gesture was matter-of-fact, as though asking this stranger to repair their home's most basic defense was perfectly reasonable. Vienna finally reached her daughter and grabbed her hand with more force than necessary, her face flushing red beneath the olive complexion that suggested Mediterranean ancestry somewhere in her bloodline. She wore a second-hand coat wrapped tight against the cold, a knitted scarf wound several times around her neck, and the kind of exhaustion that comes from working overnight shifts and raising a toddler alone. Her apology came out strangled and rushed, words tripping over each other in her haste to extract them both from this mortifying encounter with the wealthy neighbor she'd probably only seen from a distance. Killian should have kept walking toward the black sedan idling at the curb, where his driver waited to transport him to morning meetings that involved ledgers coded in ways the IRS would never decipher. He'd built his entire adult life on the principle of strategic distance, never involving himself in situations that didn't serve clear objectives or advance carefully calculated interests. His reputation in Seattle's underground networks rested on being untouchable, unreachable, and utterly focused on the business of managing what polite society called organized crime. But something in Vienna's eyes when she yanked Tilly backward made him pause with his hand on the sedan's door handle. That particular shade of fear was familiar from his childhood, from watching his own mother check locks 3 times before bed and flinch at unexpected sounds. It was the fear of women who knew exactly how thin the barrier was between safety and catastrophe, who understood that doors weren't just architectural features, but the only thing standing between their children and a world that didn't care about their vulnerability. The street seemed to hold its collective breath, while Killian studied the mother and daughter with the same analytical attention he brought to evaluating business opportunities. Vienna clutched Tilly's hand like a lifeline, her chin lifted in defiance even as humiliation colored her cheeks, clearly preparing for dismissal or worse from the wealthy neighbor. Behind them, their building sagged against the winter sky, its disrepair a stark contrast to the renovated properties on his side of the block. "What's wrong with your door?" Killian's question came out rougher than intended, his voice carrying traces of Brooklyn that 20 years in the Pacific Northwest hadn't completely erased. He ignored his driver's subtle cough of impatience and the fact that this delay would cascade through his carefully structured morning schedule. Vienna's shoulders tensed at his attention rather than relaxing, her instinct correctly identifying that interest from men like him rarely came without complications. She explained in clipped sentences about the lock mechanism that hadn't worked properly since September and the bottom hinge that scraped against the frame, and how the super kept promising repairs but never followed through. Her words painted a picture of institutional neglect, of landlords who collected rent from tenants too poor to have options and too tired to fight for basic maintenance. Tilly swayed between them, mittened hands clasped together, watching this exchange with a child's faith that adults would somehow fix problems once properly identified. Killian's phone buzzed insistently in his pocket, undoubtedly his associate wondering why they weren't moving according to schedule, but he didn't reach for it. Instead, he found himself giving a single nod that committed him to something his rational mind was already questioning, an impulse decision so unlike his usual calculated approach that his driver actually straightened in visible surprise. Vienna's expression shifted from defensive to bewildered, clearly not having expected anything beyond a polite brush-off. "I'll look at it tonight." The words came out before he'd fully considered their implications, before he'd analyzed the strategic value or potential complications of inserting himself into these strangers' lives. Tilly's face split into a grin that showed the gap where her front tooth should have been, while Vienna opened her mouth to protest or question or possibly refuse, then seemed to lose momentum mid-breath. The moment stretched awkward and uncertain until Killian turned away and slid into his sedan without offering further explanation. Through the tinted window, he watched Vienna steer Tilly toward the bus stop on the corner, both of them moving with the hurried gait of people running late for daycare drop-off and work shifts that didn't forgive tardiness. The mother kept glancing back at his departing car with an expression caught between hope and suspicion. His driver pulled into morning traffic without comment, professional enough not to question why they'd just added an unprofitable complication to an already complex day. Killian spent the first 3 miles of their drive telling himself this was simple pragmatism, that a broken door in the neighborhood represented a security gap that could eventually affect property values and local stability. He specialized in protection rackets, among other ventures, so ensuring residential security fell technically within his professional purview. The rationalization felt thin even to him, but he'd learned long ago that admitting the actual motivations for his choices often created more problems than strategic fiction. The truth he wouldn't acknowledge until much later was that Tilly's words had cracked something in the armor he'd spent 15 years constructing. "Mommy's scared," echoed through his thoughts during meetings about distribution territories and debt collection protocols, a reminder that fear wasn't always about business leverage or territorial disputes. His associate Luca finally asked about the delay during their lunch meeting at an Italian restaurant Killian owned, through layers of shell companies and silent partnerships. The question came casual and curious rather than challenging, because Luca had worked with him long enough to recognize when pushing for information would be counterproductive. Killian deflected with vague comments about neighborhood awareness and maintaining the area's reputation, explanations that were technically accurate while revealing nothing about small girls in crooked hats. That evening, long after legitimate businesses had closed for the night and the city settled into its grittier rhythms, Killian loaded a toolbox into his sedan with the efficiency of someone who'd learned basic repair skills from necessity rather than hobby. His childhood apartment had been filled with things that broke and stayed broken because his mother worked 2 jobs, and they couldn't afford professionals for problems that weren't immediately catastrophic. He'd taught himself to fix loose hinges and sticky locks and everything else that threatened their minimal sense of safety. The drive back to Capitol Hill took 12 minutes through streets gleaming with rain that had started falling at sunset, washing the city in cold water that collected in gutters and reflected streetlights in fractured patterns. His neighborhood looked different at night, the economic divisions more obvious when the renovated brownstones glowed with warm interior lighting. Killian parked directly in front of Vienna's building and carried his toolbox across the street, without bothering with the pretense of checking for observers. Let the neighborhood watch and wonder. Let them draw whatever conclusions they needed to make sense of why someone from his side of the block was crossing that invisible line with apparent purpose. He climbed the exterior stairs to the 2nd floor, where Vienna's apartment number was posted in fading digits, beside a door that did indeed hang crooked in its frame. The knock came soft but distinct at 11:47 at night, and Vienna nearly dropped the mug of tea she'd been clutching for warmth while standing at her kitchenette counter. She'd just gotten Tilly down after 2 hours of bedtime negotiations. Her shift at the 24-hour diner didn't start until 1 in the morning, and unexpected visitors at this hour never brought good news. Through the peephole she saw the man from this morning, toolbox in hand, standing in the hallway like he'd simply forgotten to mention he'd be arriving after midnight. Vienna's first instinct was to pretend she wasn't home, to stand perfectly still until he left, and she could process this surreal situation without the pressure of his actual presence. But Tilly's bedroom light switch made a distinctive click when turned on, and she'd already flipped it twice to check on her daughter during the last hour. He would have heard the apartment's sounds and know someone was awake inside, making avoidance impossible without being obviously rude to someone who'd apparently kept his unexpected promise. She opened the door with the security chain still attached, creating a gap of roughly 4 inches through which she could see Killian's face more clearly than she had in the morning's rushed encounter. His features were harder than she'd initially registered, all sharp angles and calculated composure, with dark eyes that assessed her cramped apartment's interior in a single sweep. He looked less like someone who'd volunteered for charity handyman work, and more like someone conducting reconnaissance for purposes she didn't want to consider too carefully. "You said tonight." "I assumed you meant evening, like 7 or 8. Vienna heard the defensive edge in her voice and hated it, hated that she couldn't simply accept help without immediately searching for hidden costs or ulterior motives. Her hand moved unconsciously to where she'd wedged a kitchen knife between the counter and the dish rack earlier. a precaution that had become routine whenever she was home alone. Killian's eyes tracked the movement without comment, his expression revealing nothing about whether he found her caution insulting or simply practical. "I work days. This is when I had time." His answer was economical and matter-of-fact, offering no apology for the unconventional hour or acknowledgement that most people didn't conduct home repairs near midnight. He gestured toward the door itself, where the broken lock mechanism was visible even from the hallway, its interior components exposed through gaps in the metal housing. She could refuse him entry, could claim the hour was inappropriate, and ask him to come back during daylight, when she felt less vulnerable and more capable of maintaining appropriate boundaries. But Tilly was asleep behind a door that didn't lock properly, and Vienna's next paycheck was already allocated to overdue bills that left no room for security upgrades she desperately needed. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford when basic safety was at stake. Vienna unhooked the chain and stepped back, gesturing for him to enter while maintaining maximum physical distance in the apartment's limited space. Killian moved past her with the careful awareness of someone accustomed to navigating tense situations, his body language deliberately non-threatening, even as his presence seemed to fill the small room entirely. He set his toolbox down beside the door and crouched to examine the damaged lock, his hands moving over the mechanism with the confidence of someone who'd performed this exact assessment many times before. "How long has it been broken?" His question came without looking up from his inspection, fingers testing the door's weight and the way it hung askew in the frame. Vienna wrapped her arms around herself and explained about the August break-in attempt 2 floors down that had scared her enough to finally complain to management about her own unit's security issues. The super had installed this particular lock as a supposed upgrade, but it had never worked correctly from day one. Killian made a sound that might have been disgust or dark amusement, still focused on the door's various failures with an intensity that seemed excessive for such a mundane task. He pointed out how the strike plate was mounted incorrectly, how the bottom hinge had pulled partially free from wood that was rotting from water damage, how the deadbolt's interior mechanism had been installed backward by someone who clearly didn't know what they were doing. His diagnosis was detailed and damning, painting a picture of neglect that went beyond simple deferred maintenance into genuine safety violations. "I'm going to need to remove the door completely to fix this properly." Killian finally looked up at her, his expression neutral, but something in his eyes suggesting he understood exactly how vulnerable that would make her feel. Vienna's apartment already felt too exposed with him inside it, and the idea of having no door at all made her pulse spike with anxiety. He continued before she could formulate a response, his tone shifting to something almost gentle despite the roughness in his voice. "I'll be here the entire time. No one gets past me to this apartment, I can promise you that." The statement carried absolute certainty, the kind of confidence that came from knowing his presence alone would deter most threats better than any lock mechanism ever could. Vienna studied his face for signs of arrogance or manipulation, trying to determine if this was genuine assurance or simply what predators said to make prey feel safe. Her apartment's kitchen clock showed midnight now, which meant she had roughly 45 minutes before needing to wake Tilly, drop her at the 24-hour childcare facility near the diner, and start her shift that would last until 9 the following morning. Vienna did rapid mental calculations about whether this repair could be completed in that time frame, whether she could afford to be late to work, whether refusing his help now would mean never getting another offer she desperately needed. The numbers didn't work any way she arranged them, but she found herself nodding agreement anyway, because sometimes you had to gamble on strangers' intentions when all your other options had already failed. Killian worked with methodical efficiency once given permission, using tools she couldn't name to remove the door from its hinges without damaging the surrounding frame. He leaned it against the wall and then turned his attention to the rotted wood around the strike plate, scraping away damaged material and evaluating the extent of repair needed. Vienna stayed in the kitchenette area, maintaining her position near the knife while trying not to make her distrust obvious enough to be offensive. She'd become expert at this particular balancing act, accepting help while simultaneously preparing to defend herself, if that help revealed itself as something darker. "You work nights?" Killian's question came casual, though Vienna suspected nothing about this man was actually casual, that even his small talk served some larger purpose she couldn't yet identify. She confirmed she worked the graveyard shift at Morrison's diner, omitting the details about how overnight hours paid marginally better and came with fewer customers who felt entitled to harass waitresses. He continued working while she spoke, his hands never stopping their precise movements even as he maintained conversation. Vienna found herself revealing more than she'd intended during the next 20 minutes, words spilling out to fill the strange intimacy of watching a virtual stranger repair her home's most basic defense. She mentioned Tilly's father, who'd disappeared before their daughter learned to walk, the series of increasingly expensive apartments as gentrification pushed them farther from Seattle's core, her own abandoned dreams of art school that had died under the weight of single parenthood and survival economics. Killian listened without the performative sympathy she'd learned to expect from people who asked about her situation, but didn't really want honest answers. He shared almost nothing about himself in return, deflecting her tentative questions with vague responses about property management and security consulting. The door was back on its hinges by 12:30, now hanging level and true with a lock mechanism that engaged smoothly when tested, and a deadbolt that Killian demonstrated would require serious force to breach. He'd reinforced the frame with metal plates that disappeared behind the existing trim, installed a new strike plate anchored into the wall's studs, and adjusted everything until the door closed with a solid, secure sound Vienna hadn't heard since moving in 6 months earlier. Vienna tested the lock herself 3 times, unable to quite believe that something in her apartment actually worked the way it was supposed to work, that she could turn the deadbolt and hear it engage with satisfying finality. The transformation was remarkable enough to make her eyes sting with unexpected emotion, though she blinked rapidly to clear them before Killian could notice and misinterpret her reaction. He was packing his tools with the same efficient movements he'd used throughout the repair, giving her space to process without commentary. "How much do I owe you?" The question came out more defensive than she'd intended, her tone sharp with the certainty that this kindness would have a price tag she couldn't afford. Killian paused in coiling an extension cord, his expression unreadable in the dim lighting from her single functioning overhead fixture. He seemed to consider his answer carefully, as though negotiating terms of a business contract, rather than responding to a simple request for payment information. "Nothing. Your daughter asked for help. I helped." His response was so matter-of-fact it took her a moment to process the implications, to understand he genuinely didn't expect compensation for work that must have cost him several $100s in parts alone. Vienna opened her mouth to protest, to insist she wouldn't accept charity no matter how desperately she needed it, but he was already moving toward the door with his toolbox in hand. The finality in his posture suggested this wasn't open for negotiation or discussion. He paused at the threshold, one hand on the doorknob, and pulled a business card from his coat pocket, with movements that seemed almost reluctant. The card was simple black with silver lettering that said only Killian Gallo, and a phone number. No company name or title to indicate what business he actually conducted. He set it on the small shelf beside her door without meeting her eyes, his voice dropping to something quieter when he finally spoke. "If you need anything else fixed, or if anyone bothers you, call that number." The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Vienna wasn't ready to examine. Then he was gone, pulling the door closed behind him with a soft click that demonstrated exactly how well the new lock mechanism worked. Vienna stood frozen in her entryway for a full minute, staring at the business card like it might transform into something comprehensible if she looked at it long enough. The apartment felt different with a door that actually secured, as though some fundamental shift had occurred beyond just the physical repair. Vienna could hear Tilly's soft breathing from the bedroom, could smell the faint scent of metal and oil that lingered from Killian's work, could see the first gray light of approaching dawn through her kitchen window. She should wake her daughter, begin their complicated morning routine of bus rides and childcare drop-offs and arriving at the diner exactly on time. Instead, she found herself touching the new deadbolt, testing its smooth operation one more time, trying to remember the last time someone had simply helped her without expecting anything in return. The memory wouldn't come because it had never happened, not in her adult life, not since she'd become a mother navigating the world alone. Every kindness had carried conditions. Every offer of assistance had come with strings attached that eventually tightened into constraints she couldn't escape. Days blurred together in the exhausting rhythm that defined Vienna's existence, shifts at the diner punctuated by brief hours of sleep, while Tilly was at daycare, and the constant low-level anxiety about money that never quite disappeared. She didn't see Killian again during that first week, though she found herself watching for him whenever she crossed the street, hyper-aware of his brownstone's expensive facade. The business card migrated from the shelf to her wallet, a talisman she didn't examine too closely. The radiator in Tilly's bedroom stopped working on a Thursday night, when temperatures dropped to 23 degrees and frost patterns formed on the inside of their windows. Vienna called the super twice and got voicemail both times, then spent 2 hours stuffing towels around the window frames and moving Tilly's mattress into her own room. Her daughter coughed through the night, a wet sound that made Vienna's chest tighten with the particular fear of single mothers who couldn't afford medical bills. By Friday morning, Vienna had convinced herself that Killian's offer had been politeness rather than genuine, that wealthy men didn't actually want poor neighbors calling them about domestic problems, that reaching out would be presumptuous. But Tilly's cough had worsened, and the super still wasn't returning calls, and Vienna's paycheck wouldn't clear until Tuesday. She pulled the business card from her wallet during her lunch break, staring at the numbers like they might rearrange themselves into something less intimidating. She didn't call. Instead, she shoved the card back in her wallet and finished her shift and took Tilly to the free clinic where they waited 3 hours, only to be told it was probably just a cold. Keep her warm and hydrated. The apartment was barely warmer than the outside air when they returned that evening, Vienna's breath visible in small clouds as she bundled Tilly in every blanket they owned. Her daughter's cough rattled through the silent rooms like an accusation. Vienna woke at 2 a.m. to find Tilly burning with fever, her small body shaking with chills despite the layers of blankets, and Vienna's own body heat. The thermometer read 103 degrees, high enough to trigger genuine panic, and Vienna was reaching for her phone to call an ambulance she couldn't afford when she heard sounds in the hallway outside. Footsteps, then a soft knock that somehow didn't sound threatening despite the hour. Through the peephole, she saw Killian standing in the dimly lit hallway. No toolbox this time, just a small duffel bag in one hand. Vienna's fingers fumbled with the new deadbolt, her hands shaking from fear and exhaustion. And when she finally got the door open, he took one look at her face and stepped inside without waiting for invitation. His eyes went immediately to Tilly's bedroom, to the frost on the windows, to the complete absence of heat in the apartment. "How long has the radiator been out?" His voice carried an edge that might have been anger, except it wasn't directed at her, his jaw tight as he moved through the apartment assessing the situation with the same analytical attention he'd brought to the broken door. Vienna explained in fractured sentences about the super and the clinic, and Tilly's climbing fever, her words tripping over each other in her exhaustion. Killian pulled out his phone and made a call that consisted of exactly 7 words. Capitol Hill, apartment 2B, radiator, now. He hung up and turned his attention to Tilly, crouching beside Vienna's bed where her daughter lay wrapped in blankets like a small, feverish burrito. His hand went to Tilly's forehead with surprising gentleness, and something in his expression shifted when he felt the heat radiating from her skin. From the duffel bag, he produced a bottle of children's fever reducer and a thermometer still in its packaging, along with several other medical supplies Vienna couldn't immediately identify. When did she last have medicine? Killian's question was clipped and focused, his movements efficient as he measured out the correct dosage. Vienna admitted she'd given Tilly the last of her infant pain reliever 6 hours ago, that she'd meant to buy more but forgot during her shift. He didn't comment on this, just administered the medicine, and then began the process of carefully unwrapping some of Tilly's blanket layers, explaining that too much insulation could trap the fever rather than breaking it. 20 minutes later, 2 men arrived with tools and replacement parts for the radiator, moving through Vienna's apartment with the quiet efficiency of people accustomed to working at odd hours. Killian supervised with an authority that made it clear these weren't random handymen, but people who worked for him, who would do the job correctly because failure wasn't an option he tolerated. Within an hour, heat was flowing through the bedroom radiator, transforming the space from icebox to actually habitable. The men left without requesting payment or even acknowledgement, disappearing into the night as silently as they'd arrived. Killian remained, monitoring Tilly's temperature and adjusting her blankets, and doing all the small things Vienna had been doing alone for 3 years. He made tea that Vienna didn't remember requesting, strong and sweet, in a way that suggested he understood exactly how close she was to complete collapse. When he finally pressed the warm mug into her hands, she couldn't stop the tears that had been building since she'd first heard Tilly's cough. "I can't keep doing this." The admission came out broken and raw, all the fear and exhaustion of single motherhood spilling over in the presence of someone who'd shown up when she needed help, without requiring her to perform gratitude or explain why she deserved assistance. Killian didn't offer platitudes or false reassurance, just sat on the floor beside Vienna's bed and let her cry without trying to fix the unfixable reality of her circumstances. His presence was steady and solid, an anchor in the chaos that had become her normal. Vienna went to the Thursday meeting with Tilly in tow and found herself sitting beside 2 men who introduced themselves as Luca and Marco, both wearing suits that probably cost more than her annual income. They spoke with quiet authority that made the developers' representatives visibly uncomfortable, casually mentioning building code violations and specific city council members who would be interested in development practices. The meeting transformed from rubber stamp approval of displacement into actual negotiation with terms Vienna hadn't dared hope for. The developers agreed to proper relocation assistance and rent control provisions by the meeting's end, concessions they'd never intended to offer, until confronted by men who clearly had leverage beyond what typical tenants could marshal. Luca caught Vienna's eye as they filed out, and gave her a nod that communicated volumes about loyalty networks and how Killian's quiet request carried weight. She went home that night, with relief about immediate housing security, mixing uneasily with questions about exactly what world she was becoming entangled with. December arrived with Seattle's signature rain and darkness that made 5 p.m. feel like midnight, the kind of weather that drove everyone indoors and made Vienna's diner shifts simultaneously busier and more depressing. She'd fallen into an unexpected pattern with Killian over the past month, brief conversations when their paths crossed on the street, and his periodic appearances to fix things she hadn't realized were problems. He'd replaced the overhead kitchen light fixture, installed a carbon monoxide detector, and weatherproofed her windows with efficiency that suggested a mental checklist. Tilly had started asking when Mr. Killian would visit again, her 3-year-old certainty that he was simply part of their life now both touching and concerning to Vienna. She'd tried explaining that he was just a neighbor being kind, not someone they could depend on permanently, but Tilly's understanding of social boundaries remained limited by age and optimism. The child had taken to drawing pictures specifically for him, crayon masterpieces of penguins and houses that she'd hand over with solemn importance during their street encounters. Vienna noticed Killian kept one of these drawings, had seen it on his refrigerator through his front window when passing by during an evening walk with Tilly. The image of that crude crayon art displayed in what was undoubtedly an otherwise immaculate home did something to her carefully maintained emotional distance. She'd spent 3 years building walls around herself and Tilly, defensive structures meant to prevent exactly this kind of dangerous attachment to someone whose life intersected theirs only through geographical accident. The knowledge that his birthday was approaching came accidentally, overheard during a phone conversation he was having, while standing on his front steps waiting for his driver one morning. December 15th, which was a Tuesday, which meant Vienna was working the evening shift and wouldn't see him anyway. She told herself this information didn't matter, that noting the date wasn't the beginning of something she'd regret, even as she found herself planning how she might acknowledge it, without crossing lines that were already becoming dangerously blurred. Tilly solved the problem by insisting they make cupcakes for Mr. Killian's birthday, with the unshakable certainty of children who believed the world operated according to kindness rather than complicated social contracts. Vienna agreed, because refusing would require explaining why they couldn't celebrate someone who'd helped them, and that explanation would reveal her own fears about dependency and debt. They made chocolate cupcakes from a box mix in their tiny kitchen, Tilly's help consisting mainly of spilling ingredients and licking the spoon. The result was imperfect at best, slightly lopsided cupcakes with frosting applied with more enthusiasm than skill, but Tilly was proud of them in a way that made Vienna's chest ache. They boxed up 4 of the least damaged specimens and walked across the street that evening, while Vienna wrestled with certainty that this gesture would change something fundamental. Her finger hesitated over his doorbell, but Tilly reached up and pressed it before Vienna could reconsider, sealing a decision that felt more significant than simple birthday acknowledgement. Killian answered after a long pause, and Vienna saw immediately that she'd interrupted something, though she couldn't identify what exactly. His expression was carefully neutral, but something about his eyes suggested she'd caught him in a moment of private darkness, the kind that people who lived alone tried to hide from the world. He was dressed casually for once, dark jeans and a sweater that probably still cost more than her weekly paycheck, and the house behind him was lit, but silent in a way that emphasized emptiness. Tilly wanted to bring you birthday cupcakes. Vienna offered this explanation quickly, already regretting the impulse that had brought them here, already cataloging the ways this was overstepping boundaries she should have maintained. But Tilly pushed forward with her box of imperfect baked goods, presenting them like treasure that deserved proper reverence. Killian's expression shifted then, something cracking in his careful composure, and Vienna saw with sudden clarity that no one else had acknowledged this day at all. He invited them in with a gesture that seemed almost helpless, as though he couldn't figure out how to refuse without hurting Tilly's feelings, and had given up trying to maintain whatever distance he'd intended. The interior of his brownstone was exactly what Vienna had imagined from exterior clues, all clean lines and expensive minimalism, and absolutely nothing that suggested anyone actually lived there. It was beautiful in the way museums were beautiful, perfect and untouchable, and completely devoid of the warmth that came from accumulated life. Tilly's excited chatter about the cupcake-making process filled the silence while Killian led them to his kitchen, a space with restaurant-quality appliances that probably saw minimal use. Vienna found herself noting details she shouldn't be collecting, evidence of loneliness disguised as preference for order. No magnets on the refrigerator except Tilly's drawing, no dishes in the sink because he probably ate most meals elsewhere, no signs of hobbies or interests beyond the single life he'd constructed around absence rather than presence. I should light a candle, right? For birthdays? Tilly's question made both adults freeze because neither of them had thought that far ahead, and Vienna didn't carry birthday candles in her coat pocket during evening walks. But Killian produced one from a drawer with surprising speed, a single emergency candle that would have to serve as stand-in for proper celebration. He stuck it in the least lopsided cupcake while Vienna found matches, and they stood in his pristine kitchen singing an off-key version of the birthday song. Killian blew out the candle with an expression Vienna couldn't read, something between gratitude and grief, and the kind of vulnerability that made her understand why he'd built such careful walls. Tilly demanded to know what he'd wished for, and he told her it was a secret, in the gentle tone he seemed to reserve specifically for her daughter. They ate cupcakes standing in his kitchen, Tilly chattering about penguins and Christmas, while the adults navigated the strange intimacy of this moment that neither had planned but both seemed to need. Vienna noticed the exact second Killian registered that someone had remembered his birthday, had cared enough to mark the day with however small a gesture. His jaw tightened, and he turned away briefly, ostensibly to get napkins, but more likely to collect himself before his careful control shattered completely. When he turned back, his eyes were slightly red, but his expression had settled into something approaching peace, as though he'd been carrying weight he hadn't realized could be shared even partially. Thank you. He directed this to Tilly, but his eyes found Vienna's, and the gratitude there was complex enough to make her look away. She understood suddenly that she wasn't the only one learning dangerous lessons about connection and dependency, that Killian had been just as isolated as she was, just in different ways for different reasons. His wealth had insulated him from many struggles, but had also built walls that kept out casual kindness and unexpected birthday celebrations, and children who drew pictures specifically for refrigerator display. They stayed longer than Vienna intended, Tilly exploring his house with the fearlessness of children who assumed all spaces were meant for them, while the adults followed behind, making sure she didn't break anything valuable. Killian showed Tilly his office with its wall of books, and told her about learning to read in a library, because his childhood home hadn't contained many books of its own. Vienna saw the parallels forming, the recognition passing between two adults who understood what it meant to build yourself from nothing while carrying weight of everything survived. When they finally left, Tilly was yawning and draped over Vienna's shoulder, exhausted from excitement that had sustained her past normal bedtime. Killian walked them to the door and lingered there in a way that suggested he didn't want the evening to end, didn't want to return to the silence of his beautiful, empty house. Vienna felt that reluctance echo in her own chest, the dangerous realization that she'd started wanting more of his presence than she could afford to want. She made herself say goodbye before that wanting could take root deeper. Vienna. Killian stopped her as she reached the bottom of his front steps, his voice carrying through the cold air with unusual hesitation. She turned back and found him framed in his doorway, light spilling around him in a way that somehow emphasized rather than diminished his isolation. He seemed to be wrestling with words that wouldn't come easily, his usual economy of language failing him when he needed it most. Finally, he just said, "This was the best birthday I've had in 20 years. The admission hung between them in the December air, vulnerable and honest in a way that made Vienna's throat tight. She didn't know how to respond to that kind of raw truth, didn't know what it meant that their small gesture had mattered so much to someone who seemed to have everything. So she just nodded and carried her sleeping daughter home, understanding that something fundamental had shifted between them tonight, that they'd moved past the fiction of simple neighborly assistance into territory neither of them knew how to navigate. Vienna lay awake that night, long after putting Tilly to bed, thinking about empty houses and accumulated loneliness, and the particular kind of isolation that came from having wealth, but no one to share birthday cupcakes with. She thought about Killian's expression when Tilly had handed him those imperfect baked goods, the way his careful composure had cracked to reveal genuine emotion beneath. The memory made her chest ache with feelings she couldn't afford to examine too closely. Dangerous tenderness for someone whose real life she barely understood. The next morning brought routine back with the force of necessity. Vienna's alarm shattering sleep at 5 a.m. for an early shift that would barely cover this week's groceries. She moved through morning rituals on autopilot, getting Tilly ready for daycare drop-off while mentally reviewing her section assignments and calculating tip percentages needed to make rent. Last night's birthday celebration already felt like something that had happened to someone else, a brief departure from reality that couldn't be sustained in daylight's harsh practicality. But when Vienna opened her front door to leave, she found a small package on her doorstep, wrapped in simple brown paper, with her name written in Killian's precise handwriting. Inside was a set of oil paints, professional quality brushes, and canvas boards, the kind of art supplies she'd mentioned wanting during one conversation months ago about abandoned dreams of art school. No note accompanied the gift, just materials that acknowledged both her past aspirations and current impossibility of pursuing them given her financial constraints. Vienna stood in her doorway holding supplies that probably cost more than her weekly paycheck, torn between gratitude and the uncomfortable realization that Killian had been paying closer attention to her casual comments than she'd realized. Tilly peered at the paints with interest, asking if she could use them, and Vienna heard herself promising they'd paint together soon. She tucked the supplies inside before leaving, adding them to the growing collection of ways Killian was becoming woven into the fabric of their daily existence. The diner shift was brutal, breakfast rush followed by lunch crowd with barely time to breathe between orders, and Vienna's feet ached by the time she finally clocked out at 2 p.m. She picked up Tilly from daycare and decided to stop by the corner market for milk they needed, taking the route that happened to pass Killian's brownstone. She told herself this wasn't deliberate, that she wasn't looking for him, even as her eyes tracked to his front windows checking for signs of presence. He was sitting on his front steps despite the December cold, still dressed in his usual expensive simplicity, but looking somehow less composed than she'd ever seen him. Tilly spotted him first and ran ahead before Vienna could stop her, launching into enthusiastic recap of her daycare activities. Killian listened with the focused attention he always gave her daughter, but Vienna noticed shadows under his eyes that suggested he'd slept as poorly as she had, processing whatever the previous night had stirred up between them. "Thank you for the paints." Vienna said it quietly after Tilly had exhausted her news and moved to examining ice crystals on the sidewalk. Killian's expression shifted into something that might have been embarrassment, as though he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't have, offering gifts that exceeded appropriate boundaries. He deflected with a shrug that tried for casual but missed, his usual self-assurance faltering in a way that made him seem younger and more vulnerable than his carefully constructed exterior typically allowed. "You mentioned wanting them. I happened to see them." The lie was obvious, but Vienna let it stand, because acknowledging the truth would require discussing why he remembered casual comments about her deferred dreams and cared enough to do something about them. They stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment, both aware they were navigating new territory without a map, trying to maintain fiction of simple neighborly assistance, while evidence mounted that this had become something else entirely. Tilly solved the awkward moment by inviting Killian to see her new daycare project, a painted handprint turkey that was technically from November, but remained her pride. Vienna found herself inviting him up to their apartment without fully deciding to, the words emerging before her rational mind could prevent them. Killian hesitated, and Vienna saw him weighing the implications of accepting, of crossing that threshold again outside the pretense of repairs or emergencies, of admitting they wanted each other's company beyond practical necessity. He followed them upstairs, and spent the next hour sitting on Vienna's worn couch, listening to Tilly's rambling stories, while Vienna made coffee she couldn't really afford, but wanted to offer anyway. The domesticity of the scene was striking. This dangerous man who conducted business. She didn't want to know about playing dollhouse with her daughter, and complimenting her artistic choices. Vienna watched from the kitchenette and felt something shift in her chest. Resistance crumbling under the weight of how right this felt despite all the reasons it shouldn't. When Tilly finally wore herself out and settled for a cartoon on Vienna's ancient television, the adults found themselves in the kitchen area, maintaining careful physical distance while their conversation grew more honest. Killian admitted he'd spent previous birthdays alone for the past 15 years, had trained himself to treat the date as unremarkable to avoid confronting the loneliness it represented. Vienna shared her own history of solitary celebrations since becoming a mother, how marking time felt different when you had no one to mark it with. The confessions felt dangerous in their intimacy, stripping away pretense to reveal the isolation both had been hiding beneath different exteriors. Killian's wealth, and Vienna's poverty were opposite responses to similar wounds, armor built from different materials to protect against the same fundamental fear of being truly seen and still abandoned. Understanding this created connection that went deeper than attraction or gratitude, recognition of shared damage that made them comprehensible to each other in ways they weren't to most people. "I don't know how to do this." Vienna said it quietly, meaning friendship or whatever this was becoming, meaning accepting help without knowing how to repay it, meaning allowing someone past walls she'd built for good reasons. Killian met her eyes, and she saw her own uncertainty reflected back, acknowledgement that he was equally lost in navigating this territory. His response when it came was honest in a way that made her breath catch. "Neither do I, but I don't want to stop trying." The admission hung between them, vulnerable and brave and terrifying in its implications. Vienna understood he was offering something beyond fixing doors and buying art supplies, offering himself in whatever limited capacity his complicated life allowed. She wanted to say yes immediately, but also to run, to protect herself and Tilly from inevitable hurt when this fell apart the way everything eventually did. But Tilly laughed at something on television, and Killian smiled at the sound, and Vienna found herself nodding acceptance to something she couldn't fully define. The days following that conversation developed new rhythm, Killian appearing more frequently, but with less pretense about practical purposes for his visits. Sometimes he'd bring dinner from restaurants Vienna couldn't afford. Other times he'd simply sit while she cooked modest meals and Tilly played nearby. They talked about carefully neutral topics mostly, avoiding deeper discussions about his work or her financial struggles, or what exactly they were building between them. The conversations felt like foundation being laid for structure. Neither wanted to name yet. Vienna's co-workers at the diner noticed the change in her, commenting on how she smiled more and seemed less exhausted despite working the same brutal hours. She deflected their curiosity because explaining Killian would require admitting she was developing feelings for someone whose last name she'd only recently learned, and whose business dealings she deliberately didn't examine too closely. The situation looked either like fairy tale or terrible judgment depending on perspective, and Vienna wasn't sure which interpretation was more accurate. Christmas approached with retail frenzy that made Vienna's shifts longer and more demanding, every customer's holiday stress transferring directly to exhausted waitresses who absorbed rudeness while maintaining mandatory cheerfulness. She came home one evening to find Killian had let himself in, using the key she'd given him for emergencies, had gotten Tilly from daycare, and made them dinner, and started a bath for Vienna without being asked. The gesture should have felt intrusive, but instead made her eyes sting with gratitude for someone anticipating her needs before she had to voice them. They fell into pattern of him handling evening childcare when Vienna worked late, his expensive suits traded for casual clothes while he played on their floor and read picture books with voices for different characters. Tilly had started calling him Killy because Killian was too complicated for 3-year-old pronunciation, and he'd accepted the nickname with visible emotion he tried to hide. Vienna watched them together and felt her remaining resistance dissolving, replaced by dangerous hope that maybe this could actually work, despite all the logical reasons it shouldn't. The art supplies he'd given her remained mostly unused, displayed on a shelf where Vienna could see them, but not quite bring herself to actually paint anything. Too many years had passed since she'd held a brush with creative intent rather than cleaning intent, and the supplies felt too precious to waste on attempts that might reveal she'd lost whatever talent had once justified dreams of art school. Killian noticed during one visit, his eyes tracking to the untouched paints with expression Vienna couldn't quite read. "What are you afraid of?" He asked it gently, but the question still landed hard, because Vienna knew he wasn't just talking about painting anymore. She was afraid of everything, of this fragile happiness being stripped away, of depending on someone who might disappear, of Tilly getting attached to someone who couldn't promise permanence. She was afraid of her own feelings becoming too real, of painting something that would force her to acknowledge dreams she'd buried under survival necessity. Killian didn't push when she couldn't articulate all of this, just pulled out one of the canvas boards and set it on her kitchen table with the paints arranged nearby. He didn't tell her what to paint or offer encouragement that would have felt like pressure, just created space for possibility, and then moved to distract Tilly in the other room. Vienna stared at the blank canvas for a long time before finally picking up a brush, letting muscle memory guide initial strokes, while her conscious mind tried not to overthink the act of creation she'd denied herself for years. She painted Seattle's skyline from memory, the view from her apartment window transformed by artistic license into something more hopeful than the actual vista of economic division. The process felt rusty, but also familiar, like recovering a language she'd spoken fluently in another life. Killian returned at some point to watch silently, and Vienna felt his presence as support rather than judgment, understanding that this small act of reclaiming abandoned dreams mattered more than the painting's actual quality. Vienna's ex-boyfriend appeared the week before Christmas, materializing outside the diner at the end of her shift, with timing that suggested he'd been watching her schedule for opportunity. Ryan hadn't been father material 3 years ago, and time hadn't improved him, just added harder edges to features that had once seemed carelessly handsome, rather than genuinely dangerous. He wanted money he claimed she owed him, explanations about why mutual acquaintances had mentioned seeing her with someone new, access to Tilly he'd never wanted when they'd actually been together. She told him to leave, and he grabbed her arm hard enough to leave marks, his voice dropping into the threatening register she remembered from their last months together before she'd finally escaped. The diner's cook intervened before the situation escalated further, physically removing Ryan from the premises, while Vienna stood frozen with old fear rising up to choke current confidence. Ryan left shouting promises about lawyers and custody, and making her regret keeping his daughter from him. Threats that landed hard, despite being obviously empty. Vienna took the bus home shaking, her arm throbbing where Ryan's fingers had dug in, old patterns of fear reasserting themselves with depressing ease, despite 3 years of building independence from men who used strength to compensate for lack of actual power. She'd spent years proving she could survive alone, and 5 minutes with her ex had reduced her back to feeling trapped and vulnerable. The apartment felt less secure than it had that morning despite all Killian's repairs, because locks couldn't stop someone who knew exactly which emotional vulnerabilities to exploit through history and shared biology with her daughter. She didn't tell Killian about the encounter, convincing herself it was just Ryan being Ryan, and would blow over once he realized she had nothing to give him, and no interest in reopening doors firmly closed. But Ryan appeared again 2 days later, outside Tilly's daycare, trying to gain entry by claiming parental rights he'd legally forfeited through absence. The center's director refused him access and called Vienna at work, triggering new wave of panic about gaps in her daughter's protection that she couldn't fill through vigilance alone. Vienna left her shift early and picked up Tilly, holding her daughter too tight, while trying to figure out how to handle threats that came from someone who technically had biological rights if he chose to pursue them legally. She was standing in her apartment trying to decide whether to call police or a lawyer she couldn't afford, when she heard shouting in the hallway outside. Ryan's voice, raised in drunken anger, mixed with another voice she recognized with jolt of fear, and something else she didn't want to examine. Vienna looked through her peephole and saw Killian blocking Ryan from her door, his posture radiating controlled violence that made her ex's aggression look like childish posturing by comparison. They were talking in voices too low for her to hear clearly, but Ryan's body language shifted from aggressive to defensive within seconds of whatever Killian said. She watched her ex retreat down the hallway without having reached her door, watched Killian remain motionless until Ryan disappeared down the stairs, watched him finally turn toward her apartment with expression she'd never seen before. She opened the door before he could knock, questions crowding her throat about how he'd known to be there, and what exactly he'd said to make Ryan leave, and whether she should be grateful or terrified. Killian's eyes went immediately to her arm where bruises were visible beneath her rolled-up sleeves, his jaw tightening with anger that clearly wasn't directed at her. The concern in his expression was so genuine it made Vienna's remaining defenses crumble completely, tears she'd been holding back since Ryan's first appearance finally breaking through. He won't come back. Killian stated this as absolute fact rather than hopeful prediction, and Vienna believed him because she'd seen how quickly Ryan's bravado had collapsed under whatever unspoken threat had been delivered in that hallway. She should ask what he'd said, what leverage he'd applied, what connections had been activated to solve her problem with such efficiency. Instead, she just nodded and stepped back to let him inside, acknowledging silently that they'd crossed another line together, that his protection now extended beyond fixing doors into actively managing threats to her safety. Tilly was in her bedroom playing with her penguin and didn't know about the drama that had unfolded in the hallway, didn't understand that her biological father had tried to force entry into their life after 3 years of elective absence. Vienna wanted to keep it that way, wanted to preserve her daughter's innocence about danger for as long as possible in a world that already threatened childhood security in too many ways. Killian seemed to understand this without explanation, his voice dropping to quieter register when he asked if Vienna was okay, beyond the obvious physical evidence of not being okay. She explained about their history in abbreviated form, the gradual escalation from controlling behavior to actual violence that had finally driven her to leave while pregnant, despite having nowhere to go and no resources beyond stubborn determination to protect her unborn child. The admission felt like vulnerability she shouldn't be revealing, evidence of poor judgment in relationships she'd worked hard to move past. But Killian listened without the judgment she'd expected. His questions focused on practical details about restraining orders and custody agreements rather than why she'd stayed as long as she had. "I have security cameras." Killian's statement seemed like non sequitur, until he continued explaining that footage from his brownstone captured the street including Vienna's building entrance, that he'd review it to document Ryan's harassment and provide evidence if she needed it for legal proceedings. The casual mention of surveillance felt intrusive, until Vienna realized he was offering her tools to protect herself that she lacked resources to obtain alone. He pulled out his phone and showed her the app he used for monitoring, explaining access to relevant footage anytime she needed proof. Vienna accepted this help, like she'd accepted everything else, with gratitude that felt uncomfortably close to dependence and growing acknowledgement that her life was becoming entangled with Killian's, in ways she couldn't fully untangle, even if she wanted to anymore. He stayed until she'd calmed completely, making tea she didn't remember requesting and playing with Tilly to keep the child distracted, while her mother processed recent fear. When he finally left hours later, Vienna felt the apartment's silence differently than before. No longer comforting isolation, but absence of presence she'd started wanting there permanently. Christmas Eve arrived with rare Seattle snow that transformed the city into something briefly magical, covering grime and inequality beneath a layer of white that made everything look cleaner than it actually was for however long the snow lasted. Vienna had worked the morning shift and returned home to find delivery on her doorstep. Multiple wrapped packages addressed to Tilly with card and handwriting she recognized. Inside were art supplies for children, good quality paints and paper and brushes that acknowledged Tilly's growing interest in copying her mother's recent creative attempts. The gifts were generous without being excessive, chosen with attention to what Tilly would actually enjoy, rather than expensive items meant to impress adults with price tags. Vienna found herself texting thank you to Killian's number with fingers that shook slightly from how this felt like accepting admission that they'd moved beyond neighborly favors into territory she wasn't ready to name fully. His response came immediately. "Merry Christmas." Then, after pause long enough, she'd thought the conversation was over. "I have nowhere to be tomorrow if you need help assembling toys or just company for dinner." The offer was casual, but carried weight of loneliness that matched her own, neither of them having family to spend holidays with, or money for celebrations that looked like versions advertised on television and in movies. Vienna found herself inviting him for Christmas dinner without fully deciding to do it, the words appearing in her text before her rational mind could prevent them. She'd planned a simple meal she could afford on her budget, nothing fancy but enough to make the day feel special for Tilly beyond the modest gifts Vienna had scraped together. Adding another person wouldn't strain resources too badly, and the thought of Killian spending the holiday alone in his perfect empty house bothered her more than she wanted to admit or examine too closely. His acceptance came fast enough to suggest he'd been hoping for the invitation, that spending Christmas alone had become routine he disliked, but didn't know how to break without someone else initiating change. Vienna spent that evening questioning whether she'd just made everything more complicated or acknowledged what had already been true for weeks. Christmas morning brought Tilly's excitement and chaos of torn wrapping paper, and the realization that Vienna had maybe invited a Mafia boss to holiday dinner without fully processing what that meant for boundaries she'd been trying to maintain. Killian arrived precisely at noon, with wine she suspected cost more than her monthly grocery budget and dessert, from a bakery that definitely didn't match her financial reality. He fit into her small apartment better than his wealth suggested he should, playing on the floor with Tilly and her new toys while Vienna prepared their modest meal. They ate at her cramped table with mismatched plates and conversation that felt easier than it should have between people from such different worlds, laughter coming naturally around Tilly's excitement and commentary. Vienna watched Killian help her daughter with toy assembly, and felt dangerous hope taking root that maybe this could actually work, despite every logical reason it shouldn't. He looked more relaxed than she'd ever seen him, his usual careful control softened by wine and warmth, and the absence of whatever pressure he carried in his regular life outside these walls. After dinner, while Tilly played with new toys in the living area, Vienna and Killian ended up at her kitchen window, watching snow fall on the quiet street below. Their shoulders touched in the small space, proximity that felt both accidental and entirely deliberate, connection neither of them moved to break. The moment stretched with unspoken acknowledgement passing between them, understanding that something fundamental had shifted during this holiday celebration, and there was no going back to pretending they were just neighbors doing favors for each other across economic divides. "Thank you for letting me be here today." Killian said it quietly, his breath fogging the cold window glass, vulnerability in his tone that Vienna had learned to recognize as genuine rather than manipulative. She turned to respond, and found him already looking at her with expression that made her heart skip, something raw and unguarded in his eyes that spoke of yearning that matched her own. The kiss happened inevitably, neither initiating so much as moving together into connection that had been building for months through accumulated small moments and shared loneliness. The kiss ended slowly, both of them pulling back with expressions that mixed wonder and uncertainty about what they'd just acknowledged between them. Vienna's heart hammered against her ribs, while Killian's hand remained on her waist, neither of them quite ready to fully break contact. Tilly's voice called from the living room asking for help with a toy, breaking the moment, and giving them both excuse to step apart and process what had just happened without the pressure of immediate discussion about implications. The rest of Christmas Day passed in careful normalcy, both adults maintaining appropriate distance, while Tilly remained the center of attention and activity. But something had fundamentally shifted, visible in the way Killian's eyes tracked Vienna's movements, and how she found herself hyper-aware of his presence in ways that went beyond grateful friendship. When he finally left that evening, his goodbye lingered at her doorway, with unspoken questions hanging between them about what came next, and whether they were brave enough to pursue answers. January arrived with the particular brutality of Seattle winter, temperatures dropping below freezing and staying there while the city struggled through ice storms that made commuting treacherous. Vienna's hours at the diner were cut as business slowed, leaving her short on rent money with utilities climbing from increased heating needs. She avoided mentioning this to Killian during their now regular evening visits, pride preventing her from appearing like she'd kissed him with calculation about financial security rather than genuine feeling that had been building for months. But Killian had developed disturbing ability to read her silences, and he appeared one evening with paperwork that made Vienna's stomach drop with combination of relief and dread. He'd been looking into her building's ownership structure and discovered the entire property was going up for sale, likely to be purchased by developers who would gut renovate and displace all current tenants within months. The news wasn't surprising given the neighborhood's trajectory, but having timeline put to her inevitable displacement made panic rise sharp and immediate. "I want to buy you a house." Killian said it directly. No preamble or softening, just statement of intention that landed between them like bomb waiting to detonate. Vienna's immediate reaction was refusal, the word forming before he'd finished speaking, because accepting housing from him would cross lines she couldn't uncross. But he continued before she could articulate her rejection, pulling out listings for modest homes in safer neighborhoods with better schools and yards where Tilly could play without Vienna constantly worried about traffic or crime. Not a gift, a loan, or whatever terms make you comfortable. He was negotiating now, applying the same strategic thinking he brought to his actual business dealings, trying to find framework Vienna could accept. She wanted to maintain her refusal, but Tilly was playing nearby, and Vienna thought about trying to find new apartment with first and last month's rent plus deposit while working reduced hours. The math didn't work, hadn't worked for a while, and pretending she had options when she didn't was luxury she couldn't afford. They argued in whispers while Tilly watched her cartoon, Vienna insisting she wouldn't accept charity, and Killian countering that helping someone he cared about wasn't charity, but investment in future he wanted to be part of. The phrasing stopped her cold because it was first time either of them had explicitly named that they were building towards something beyond present moment. His eyes held hers with intensity that made clear this wasn't about property transactions, but about commitment he was trying to offer in language she might accept. "I can't pay you back. Not in any reasonable time frame." Vienna made herself say it plainly, forcing acknowledgement of economic reality that made power dynamics between them fundamentally unequal. Killian's expression suggested he'd already considered and dismissed this concern as irrelevant to his actual motivations. He explained patiently about property being investment that would appreciate regardless, about wanting Tilly safe in neighborhood where broken doors weren't normal, about Vienna having space to paint, without worrying about whether creativity time could have been spent working extra shifts. The last point hit harder than the others because he'd noticed what Vienna had been trying to hide, that the art supplies he'd given her remained mostly unused because every hour spent painting felt like hours she should have been earning money. He'd identified the exact way poverty killed dreams, not through lack of talent, but through grinding necessity that made creativity seem like irresponsible indulgence. Understanding this about her circumstances made his offer feel less like rescue fantasy and more like someone paying attention to what she actually needed beyond material basics. Vienna agreed finally with conditions that made the transaction feel less like accepting kept woman status and more like complicated loan arrangement between people who trusted each other. She'd pay what she could when she could. He'd maintain legal ownership until some distant future when she'd theoretically paid enough to transfer title, and they'd document everything properly to avoid implications she couldn't stomach. Killian accepted her terms without argument, clearly willing to structure the arrangement however necessary for Vienna to preserve dignity she needed to maintain sense of self. The house he'd found was small but solid in a neighborhood that straddled line between working class and lower middle class, the kind of area where people mowed lawns and kids played in streets under watchful neighborhood eyes. It had 2 bedrooms and a yard with fence and kitchen that actually had counter space beyond minimum required for food preparation. Vienna walked through it feeling like she'd stepped into someone else's life, someone who had security and options and future that extended beyond next month's rent payment. Tilly loved it immediately, with child's certainty that good things were simply meant to happen, running through rooms and claiming the smaller bedroom as her own without doubt or hesitation. Vienna watched her daughter's joy and felt something break open in her chest, the possibility that maybe she could actually provide stability instead of constant precarious scrambling. Killian stood back, letting them explore, his expression carefully neutral, but satisfaction visible in the set of his shoulders at having solved a problem that had been weighing on Vienna for months. The move happened over 2 weeks in February, Killian's associates appearing with trucks and muscle to transport Vienna's minimal belongings while she worked her shifts. She came home each day to find more progress, furniture she hadn't owned suddenly appearing in rooms that echoed without it. When she questioned these additions, Killian deflected with vague explanations about storage cleanouts and surplus from his own place, obvious lies she chose not to challenge because the alternative was Tilly sleeping on floor in empty bedroom. Their first night in the new house felt surreal. Vienna lying awake in bedroom with door that locked properly and windows that didn't let in cold air and heating system that actually maintained temperature. Tilly slept in the next room with nightlight that Vienna had bought specifically for this space, small luxury of child having her own bedroom for first time. The silence was different from their apartment, absence of sirens and shouting neighbors, and constant background noise of too many people living too close together in inadequate spaces. Killian appeared the next morning, with breakfast from bakery and tools, to install additional security measures he deemed necessary for house in this neighborhood. Vienna watched him work while Tilly helped by handing him screws and asking endless questions. He answered with patience that seemed inexhaustible where her daughter was concerned. The domesticity of the scene was almost painful in its normalcy, temporary illusion that they were family building life together, rather than something more complicated she couldn't quite name. Stay. Vienna said it without planning to, the word emerging while Killian packed his tools to leave after finishing security installation. He froze mid-motion and turned to look at her with expression that suggested he'd been hoping for this invitation, but hadn't wanted to presume. She clarified quickly that she meant for dinner, not some more permanent arrangement, but something in his eyes told her he'd understood the deeper invitation beneath the surface request. He stayed, and they made dinner together in kitchen that had room for 2 people to move without constantly colliding. That night, after Tilly was in bed, they sat on Vienna's secondhand couch in living room that was slowly becoming home through accumulated small touches. The conversation turned serious when Killian finally addressed the question Vienna had been avoiding asking directly. He explained that his business involved security consulting and property management for clients who operated outside conventional legal frameworks, careful phrasing that confirmed what she'd suspected about his connections to Seattle's organized crime networks without forcing her to hear details that would make complicity explicit. Vienna processed this information while watching him try to gauge her reaction, clearly prepared for judgment or rejection, but she'd already known enough to guess the rest, and his honesty about it felt like respect for her intelligence rather than confession seeking absolution. She asked only one question that mattered to her, whether his work put Tilly at risk, and his immediate emphatic negative carried weight of someone who would die before allowing harm to reach the child he'd come to care about. That assurance was enough for Vienna to accept his world existed parallel to hers, without demanding he choose between them. Spring arrived gradually through March and April, Seattle's famous rain continuing but warmer now, bringing green back to the small yard where Tilly played under Vienna's watchful eyes. The house had settled into feeling like actual home through accumulated routines and Killian's increasingly frequent presence that had evolved from visits into something approaching cohabitation. He kept clothes in Vienna's closet now, toiletries in her bathroom, his life bleeding into hers, through practical intimacy that preceded official relationship definitions. Either of them felt ready to speak aloud. Vienna had returned to full-time hours at the diner as business picked up with better weather. Her commute longer now from new neighborhood, but worth it for returning to apartment that was actually house with space and safety. She'd started painting in evenings after Tilly went to bed. Small canvases at first because confidence took time to rebuild after years of neglect. Killian encouraged without pushing, his appreciation for her work genuine, even when Vienna could see technical flaws that made her wince. He'd hung several pieces in the living room despite her protests, claiming the walls looked bare without them. Tilly had adjusted to the move with resilience of childhood, making friends with neighboring kids and starting to call Killian Daddy in moments of excitement, before correcting herself to Killy when she remembered. Neither adult corrected her either way, both recognizing that she was naming reality that already existed regardless of technical legal definitions. Killian's response to the title was always visible emotion he tried to control, clear evidence that being chosen by this child meant more to him than achievements that had built his wealth and reputation. The neighborhood accepted Vienna's presence with the cautious welcome, extended to newcomers who might or might not integrate into existing social fabric. She'd met some of the other mothers at the small park 2 blocks away, conversations remaining surface level, but friendly enough. They asked about Tilly's father with the careful curiosity of people trying to determine Vienna's situation, without appearing judgmental, and she deflected with vague references to complicated circumstances that discouraged further probing while remaining technically honest. Money remained tight, despite no longer paying rent, because utilities and maintenance on actual house cost more than Vienna had budgeted for. Killian had tried to simply pay these expenses, but Vienna refused with stubbornness that frustrated them both, her need to contribute something toward their living situation non-negotiable, even when pride made finances harder. They'd finally compromised on her covering utilities, while he handled larger maintenance issues that required expertise or expensive parts, division that felt less like charity and more like partnership between people with different resources. Ryan's threatened custody challenge never materialized beyond initial bluster, and Vienna learned through mutual acquaintances that he'd left Seattle entirely after some unspecified encounter that had convinced him pursuing Tilly was dangerous to his health. She didn't ask Killian directly what had happened, some questions better left unexamined, but she understood that protection he'd promised was both real and potentially frightening in its thoroughness. The knowledge should have concerned her more than it did, but maternal instinct toward safety trumped moral complications about methods. Vienna's supervisor at the diner had noticed the change in her, commenting on how she seemed lighter somehow despite still working the same demanding shifts. She'd been offered promotion to shift manager with modest pay increase, recognition that her reliability and competence deserved acknowledgement. The extra money would help with the constant financial juggling Vienna performed, and the title felt like validation that she was building toward something beyond just survival. She'd accepted immediately, pride mixing with relief about having one piece of stability that came from her own efforts rather than Killian's intervention. The promotion meant different hours that aligned better with Tilly's preschool schedule, reducing childcare costs that had been eating significant portion of Vienna's paycheck. It also meant she'd be home more evenings when Killian typically appeared after his own work obligations, creating space for relationship to deepen through accumulated dinner conversations and quiet moments after Tilly slept. They'd fallen into pattern that felt increasingly like actual family, rather than convenient arrangement between lonely people seeking connection. Killian's business associates had become occasional presence in their lives, Luca and Marco appearing for dinners that Vienna suspected were as much about checking on their boss's well-being as socializing. She'd learned to read the subtle dynamics between the men, understanding that Killian's associates were both concerned about his attachment to civilian life and protective of happiness they recognized he'd been lacking. Their acceptance of Vienna seemed to grant permission for relationship to continue, removing obstacles she hadn't fully known existed within his world's power structures. Summer arrived with rare Seattle heat that drove everyone outdoors, and Vienna spent weekends at the park with Tilly, while Killian worked obligations he couldn't explain in detail. She'd stopped asking for specifics about his business dealings, accepting that compartmentalization was necessary for her own peace of mind about moral implications. What mattered was how he treated Tilly with unfailing gentleness, how he showed up consistently when promising to be somewhere, how he'd quietly paid off medical bill Vienna had been struggling with when Tilly had needed emergency dental work after playground accident. The painting Vienna had been working on for weeks finally felt complete in late June. Oil portrait of Tilly playing in their yard with afternoon light filtering through trees. She'd captured her daughter's joy with skill that surprised her, muscle memory returning stronger than expected from years of dormancy. Killian found her staring at the finished canvas with mixed emotions about whether it was actually good or whether motherhood had made her judgment too soft. His assessment when she asked was characteristically direct, pointing out technical strengths while acknowledging she'd captured something essential about childhood happiness that transcended mere technique. "You should show these somewhere." Killian gestured to the collection of completed paintings that had accumulated in their spare bedroom, Vienna's reluctant portfolio that she'd been treating as private hobby rather than potential professional work. The suggestion made her immediately defensive. Years of poverty taught caution about hoping for anything beyond basic survival, making ambition feel dangerous. But he persisted with patience that had become familiar, researching local galleries that accepted new artists and even making introductory contact with owner he knew through tangential business connection. Vienna found herself agreeing to gallery meeting with the same reluctant acceptance that characterized how she'd come to accept most of Killian's help, resistance eroding under combination of his certainty and her own buried dreams, finally having space to breathe. The gallery owner was a professional woman named Sarah, who examined Vienna's work with critical eye before offering tentative interest in showing several pieces in group exhibition planned for autumn. The possibility felt unreal enough that Vienna almost declined from pure fear of failure, but Killian's hand on her lower back steadied her enough to accept opportunity she never would have pursued alone. The preparation for the exhibition consumed Vienna's evenings in ways that felt both exhilarating and terrifying, hours spent selecting which pieces best represented her artistic voice while second-guessing every choice. Killian had converted the garage into proper studio space without consulting her first, appearing one Saturday with contractors who installed professional lighting and proper ventilation systems that transformed the space from storage area into actual workspace. Vienna had been angry about the presumption until she'd stood in the completed studio feeling possibility expand in ways the cramped spare bedroom had never allowed, understanding that sometimes his solutions to problems she hadn't articulated came from paying attention, rather than overstepping boundaries she'd established. The neighborhood women had started inviting Vienna to their weekly coffee gatherings, casual meetings at the local cafe where they discussed everything from school politics to personal struggles with the kind of honesty that came from shared circumstances. She'd learned that Marcus, 2 doors down, was recently divorced and struggling with custody arrangements, that Jennifer across the street was considering leaving her husband but feared financial instability, that Rebecca next door was supporting her elderly parents while raising 3 kids on teacher's salary. Their problems weren't identical to Vienna's history, but close enough that she could offer perspective from someone who'd survived similar challenges, and slowly she'd become part of community support network, rather than just recipient of neighborly politeness. Killian's mother's death anniversary fell in September. Date Vienna only knew because she'd found him sitting alone in the dark living room at 3 a.m, unable to sleep through the weight of old grief. He'd told her haltingly about the woman who'd raised him in poverty while working herself to exhaustion, who'd died from treatable illness because she'd delayed seeking medical care she couldn't afford until it was too late. The story explained so much about his compulsive need to fix things for Vienna and Tilly, his inability to watch people struggle with problems money could solve when he had resources his mother had never possessed. Vienna had held him while he cried for the first time in their relationship, understanding that his strength came with cracks that needed witnessing rather than fixing. Walking home from that meeting, Vienna found herself crying without quite understanding whether the tears were joy, or fear, or grief. For years she'd lost to survival mode that had forbidden artistic ambition. Killian held her, while she processed emotions that had been suppressed so long they emerged tangled and overwhelming. He didn't offer platitudes about deserving success or talent being obvious, just presence that had become anchor she'd stopped pretending she didn't need. When she finally calmed, he asked only if she was okay, and Vienna realized she was. Maybe for first time in years she was actually okay. Tilly's 4th birthday in August became celebration that involved both their neighborhood friends and some of Killian's associates, strange mixing of worlds that somehow worked through shared focus on making Little Girl's Day special. Vienna watched her daughter blow out candles surrounded by people who cared about her happiness, and felt dangerous hope that maybe they'd actually built something sustainable here. Killian caught her eye across the cake and smiled with expression that suggested he was thinking similar thoughts about permanence and future and family chosen rather than inherited. The evening after party ended, when Tilly was asleep and house was quiet except for their low conversation in the kitchen. Killian finally said what they'd both been avoiding making explicit. He wanted this to be real, wanted to be part of their lives, not as helpful neighbor or convenient solution to Vienna's problems, but as partner who stayed through difficulties and celebrated victories and showed up consistently because that's what family meant. Vienna listened to his halting explanation of feelings he clearly wasn't practiced at expressing, and felt her own careful control cracking under weight of how much she wanted exactly what he was offering. "I love you," Vienna said it first, because Killian seemed unable to find words, his usual articulate precision failing him when vulnerability was required. The confession felt terrifying and liberating simultaneously, acknowledgement of truth that had been growing for months, through accumulated small moments of care and presence. Killian's response was kiss, that communicated what words couldn't, relief and joy and promise that he'd been wanting permission to make. When they finally broke apart, he repeated her words back with voice that shook slightly, admitting what they both already knew but needed spoken aloud to make real. 1 year passed with the kind of speed that characterized happy periods, time marked by Tilly's growth spurts, and Vienna's increasingly confident painting, and Killian's gradual integration into their daily life, until separation became unthinkable. The house had evolved through their combined presence, his expensive minimalism softened by her artistic touches, and Tilly's cheerful chaos. Neighbors had stopped asking about their relationship status, simply accepting them as family unit that functioned well regardless of technical marital definitions. Vienna's gallery show in October had sold 3 paintings, modest success that felt monumental to someone who'd buried artistic ambitions under survival necessity for years. The money went into savings account Killian had helped her establish, fund for Tilly's future education that grew slowly but represented possibility Vienna had never imagined accessible. She'd continued painting with increasing confidence, building portfolio while maintaining diner job that provided independence she needed, even as Killian's presence made survival less desperate. The house's mortgage had been mysteriously paid off in November, paperwork arriving that showed Vienna as sole owner with no remaining debt. When she'd confronted Killian about this obvious violation of their loan agreement, he'd simply stated that he wanted her to have security that didn't depend on his continued presence. The gesture terrified Vienna precisely because it demonstrated commitment that made his potential departure devastating possibility, but she'd accepted with understanding that sometimes gifts were about giving rather than receiving, and she needed to let him care for her in ways his emotions demanded. Tilly had started calling Killian Dad exclusively by December, the transition from nickname happening naturally through accumulated months of him functioning in that role, regardless of biological reality. His formal adoption petition, filed in January, had made Vienna cry in courthouse bathroom, overwhelmed by concrete evidence that he'd chosen them as permanently as legal system allowed. The process would take months to complete, but intention mattered more than paperwork. Public declaration that they were building real family from pieces of their individual brokenness. The winter had been easier than previous years, house properly insulated and heating functioning reliably, and Killian's presence meaning Vienna never faced crises alone anymore. They'd established routines that felt sustainable, division of labor that played to their respective strengths while acknowledging limitations. Killian cooked breakfast before leaving for his business obligations. Vienna handled evening meals when she wasn't working, and Tilly helped both with enthusiasm that exceeded actual usefulness, but built sense of shared responsibility. Vienna had been painting in their spare bedroom, converted into studio space, when Killian appeared one February evening with expression that suggested important conversation was coming. He'd been increasingly present lately, spending most nights in their house rather than maintaining pretense of separate residence across town in Brownstone he rarely visited. The shift from visiting to living together had happened gradually enough that pinpointing exact transition moment was impossible, but they'd crossed that line months ago through accumulated intimacy that preceded formal discussion. "Marry me." "Bob," Killian said it without preamble, while Vienna was still holding paintbrush, his usual economy of language employed for most important question he'd likely ever asked. Vienna's hand shook enough that she had to set brush down carefully to avoid dripping paint on floor, her mind racing through implications while her heart had already decided answer. She'd sworn after Ryan that she'd never give another man legal power over her life, But Killian had already proven himself through a year of consistent presence and care that demanded nothing beyond what she willingly offered. Yes. Vienna's answer came simpler than the question. Single word that contained commitment she'd been building toward through accumulated trust and love that had grown despite her best efforts at self-protection. Killian's relief was visible in the tension leaving his shoulders, evidence he'd genuinely feared rejection, despite year of evidence suggesting otherwise. He produced ring that was elegant without being ostentatious, his usual good taste applied to jewelry that Vienna could actually imagine wearing while working, rather than leaving locked away for special occasions. They married in April at small courthouse ceremony with Luca and Marco as witnesses, and Tilly serving as flower girl with serious dedication to her responsibilities. Vienna wore simple dress she'd found secondhand, but felt beautiful in, while Killian abandoned his usual expensive suits for clothing that matched ceremony's low-key intimacy. The lack of fanfare felt right for people who'd built their relationship through quiet consistency rather than grand gestures, commitment acknowledged through paperwork that made legal what had already been true emotionally. The honeymoon was weekend at Seattle Hotel because Vienna couldn't take extended time from work, and they both agreed Tilly was too young to leave for longer periods. But the 2 nights felt luxurious anyway. Room service and uninterrupted sleep and time to simply be together without responsibilities intruding. They talked about future in concrete terms for first time, discussing where Tilly might go to school, and whether Vienna could eventually paint full-time, and how Killian was considering transitioning his business toward more legitimate operations now that he had family to consider beyond just himself. Returning home felt different after officially becoming family. Same house, but weighted with new significance about permanence they'd created together. Vienna had worried marriage might change dynamics that worked well informally, but instead found security in knowing their commitment was witnessed and documented beyond just private understanding. Killian seemed similarly grounded by official status. His usual careful control softened by certainty that she'd chosen him publicly in ways that couldn't be easily undone. Vienna's mother had reached out in May after years of silence. The email, arriving like ghost from past Vienna, had worked hard to leave behind. The message was brief and carefully worded, expressing regret about their estrangement and hope for reconciliation now that she'd heard through family channels about Vienna's marriage and stability. The contact stirred complicated emotions Vienna had thought she'd processed. Anger at abandonment during her most desperate years, mixing with the small wounded part of her that had never stopped wanting maternal approval. Killian had read the email when she'd shown him with shaking hands, and his only question was what Vienna wanted rather than what she thought she should do, giving her permission to choose herself in ways she'd rarely been granted. They'd met for lunch in June at Neutral Restaurant where Vienna's mother had apologized with words that seemed genuine, but couldn't erase years of absence when Vienna had been raising Tilly alone in fear and poverty. Her mother explained about her own struggles with Vienna's choices, about religious beliefs that had made single motherhood seem like moral failure she couldn't support, about regret that had grown as years passed and grandchild grew up without her presence. Vienna had listened and felt surprising lack of anger, just sadness for time lost, and understanding that forgiveness didn't require forgetting or pretending damage hadn't occurred. She'd agreed to limited contact for Tilly's sake. Supervised visits where her mother could know her granddaughter without having access to disrupt the stability Vienna had fought so hard to build. The decision to allow her mother back into their lives in controlled capacity had sparked Vienna's most honest conversation with Killian about fear and trust, and how trauma shaped the walls people built around themselves. He'd shared more about his own father's abandonment, and the years he'd spent building empire specifically to prove he wasn't the worthless kid his father had left behind without looking back. They'd recognized themselves in each other's damage, understanding that their careful approach to relationship had been less about not caring enough and more about caring so much that vulnerability felt dangerous. The acknowledgement had deepened their connection in ways that transcended physical intimacy, building foundation of emotional honesty that made their marriage feel like partnership between equals rather than rescue dynamic Vienna had initially feared. Summer brought Vienna's second gallery show with stronger sales that suggested her work might actually become viable income source eventually. She'd started teaching painting classes at community center, sharing skills while earning supplemental income that reduced financial dependency on Killian in ways that mattered to her sense of self. He'd encouraged this expansion of her professional identity with genuine pride, understanding that she needed contribution beyond domestic sphere, even though money itself wasn't necessary concern. Tilly thrived in kindergarten, reading above grade level, and making friends with ease that suggested she'd inherited neither parents' childhood social difficulties. She'd told her class about her family in show and tell, explaining matter-of-factly that her daddy wasn't born her daddy but chose to be, which apparently made him extra special. The teacher had shared this with Vienna during parent conferences, with expressions suggesting she found their unconventional family origin story touching rather than problematic. Killian's adoption of Tilly was finalized in September, official ceremony in judges' chambers that made legal what had been emotional reality for over a year. Tilly had asked why they needed court to say Killian was her dad when she already knew he was, question that held wisdom beyond her 5 years. But she'd enjoyed the formal acknowledgement anyway, judge giving her certificate with her new legal name that she'd clutched proudly all day. Vienna had watched her husband and daughter together afterward, and felt grateful for broken door that had somehow led to this unlikely but perfect family. The house had become center of their expanding social world, hosting dinners for neighbors and Killian's associates and Vienna's co-workers, who'd become genuine friends once she'd let walls down enough to allow connection. Luca had commented during one gathering that he'd never seen Killian this settled, observation made with approval that suggested his loyalty extended to supporting his boss's happiness, even when it meant stepping back from certain business operations. Vienna understood that Killian was gradually extracting himself from most dangerous aspects of his work, prioritizing family safety over profit, in ways that only became possible once he had family worth prioritizing. One evening in October, Vienna found Killian standing in Tilly's doorway, watching their daughter sleep, with expression of wonder that hadn't diminished, despite year of this being his nightly routine. She joined him in silent observation, both of them marveling at small person they were raising together through combination of intention and luck. Killian's arm came around her waist automatically, pull that had become unconscious gesture of connection. They stood there until Tilly shifted in sleep, and they retreated to their own bedroom, still amazed by the family they'd built from loneliness and broken doors and small girl's innocent request for help. Vienna thought sometimes about that December morning, when Tilly had asked stranger to fix their door because mommy was scared, about how that simple request had opened door to life she couldn't have imagined during those desperate early months in deteriorating apartment. Killian had fixed more than door that first night, had repaired vulnerabilities Vienna had thought permanent through consistent presence that demanded nothing beyond what she could freely give. They'd both been broken in different ways, both hiding isolation behind different strategies, and Tilly's innocent trust had forced them into connection that healed through shared vulnerability. The door that had started everything hung properly in house they now owned together, solid and secure, like the family that had formed around it. Vienna could still remember the fear that had made her daughter ask for help, could trace direct line from that moment to marriage and adoption and life that felt sustainable in ways she'd stopped believing possible. Sometimes the best things came from asking for help when you needed it most, from letting walls down enough to accept care from unexpected sources, from choosing to believe that not everyone who offered assistance came with hidden costs attached. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please write in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you more stories about hope, second chances, and the unexpected ways love finds us when we need it most. See you in the next one.